What's up, Wildside besties and baddies? I'm Bailey.
And I'm Chelsea, and we're here to walk you through the wild sides.
From homicides to hosticides and everything in between.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. I know what I want, and I want it now.
I want you. Something.
'Cause you're Mr. Vain.
'Cause you're Mr. Vain. That's right.
I think that's how it goes.
I think so.
'Cause you're a pain, Danilo Restivo.
Oh, bless. You're still not over that case.
It pisses me off so bad. I literally, when I just want to get mad, instead of picking a fight at my husband, I just go look at his picture.
Right?
And I just look at him and I'm just like, I hate this guy.
It's kind of like Seinfeld, right? Where Newman or Jerry is always like, Newman, right?
Yes.
Bailey's always like, Danilo.
I am Michael Scott towards Toby.
And Toby.
And how he's always just like, why are you the way that you are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like the chick off of the original Ghostbusters, right? The front desk receptionist, where she's like, this is Ghostbusters. Yes. Oh, really? Yes, sir. We'll send them right out. And she's like, we got one. Right? So we got a new review. We got one.
That's great.
We want to do a shout out to Da Honey Badger 52. Thank you so much for the kind raving review. And she talks about that she loves the banter that we have. And hopefully all of you guys know we are sisters. Yeah. Right? I mean, surely you know this by this point, but in case you didn't know, we are blood sisters.
Sisters.
Sheester.
Yeah. Thanks, Da Honey Badger. Appreciate it.
That's a cool name too.
Yeah, it's great. I always, and I don't want this to sound negative, but I always, when you get a new review, I'm always like, I hope it's this random person from like Idaho that somehow found our podcast. I'm so excited.
Mm-hmm.
And then I hope deep down secretly it's not like,
our mom
our mom.
Yeah. Like just creating new accounts.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. So
I know it might be. You never know.
Thanks, Mom, or the Honey Badger, or it's definitely not Mom. I know that, but it might be like a family member, like our third cousin.
It might be somebody from Ohio because apparently Ohio loves us.
And New York.
Dude, New York and Ohio. I mean, obviously Texas. We have a lot of listeners in Texas, but New York and Ohio, shout out, man.
Yeah.
Love y'all. Thank you.
Thanks for loving some Southern people. And I'm okay that you say pecans and pop. I don't discriminate.
No, it's fine. It's totally good.
Yeah. So, okay, this week, you guys, is going to be a testy week for many of our listeners, including Chelsea.
Oh, gross. What is this interview week?
It is interview week. Do you know with whom?
No, I don't. I've lost track.
It's with Tim.
Don't say it's with Tim.
No, we love you, Tim.
Yes.
It's what you represent.
Yes. Oh, because that means clergy
abuse.
Oh, it's clergy abuse week, guys. Oh, I think I probably have just like mentally blocked this week because I'm just not looking forward to it.
And so we are covering a black collar case.
So remind me again what black collar is specifically.
It's towards somebody in a position of power, usually like clergy or teachers or coaches, from my understanding.
Okay.
And so today I am bringing you a black collar case.
Oh, man. Were there quite a few black collar cases that you could have chosen, or were they a little bit more slim pickings?
So it was kind of difficult because there were tons and tons and tons and tons of like macro cases, like entire I don't know the correct terminology, so forgive me, you guys, but like entire dioceses that uncovered, like 30 years of abuse scandals.
Gotcha.
And so there were a lot of those to choose from literally all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt like I couldn't, I didn't know how to write a really good narrative on such a big case. You know
Well,
what
I
I
mean,
mean?
that's where it's almost, those cases almost would require an entire podcast. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
to cover all of the ins and outs of something that colossal. So that
Yeah.
makes sense.
So this case is going to be a lot. It is for sure a wild case. I want you guys to give me the benefit of the doubt and stick with me because it's going to feel like it kind of bounces all over the place. And you're like, what does this have to do with this? Have to do with this?
Mm-hmm.
But at the very end, I felt it was the best way to kind of go through chronologically. And at the end, we tie everything together and it gets you your answers.
Okay.
But you are also left with none.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you get your answers, but you don't get any closure.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give a trigger alert to you guys. This has to do a lot with sexual abuse. It has to do with, there is homicide, there is suicide. There's kind of the whole, what I was trying to say last episode was the whole kit and caboodle.
Oh, kit and caboodle. There you go.
Yeah, it's got the whole kit and caboodle. Okay. And so this case centers primarily around one individual of the clergy, and there will be 2 victims involved. Well, actually, there's many, many victims, but there are 2 murder victims in this process.
Okay.
And so today we are going to be talking about Reverend Ryan Erickson. And I had to look it up. So apparently you can use Reverend and Father interchangeably because I'm not super savvy with like colloquial terms or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And so from my understanding, Reverend is a formal title, and then Father is kind of the more layperson term.
Okay.
From my understanding, you guys feel
Okay.
free to correct me if I'm wrong. So if I go back and forth between Reverend and Father, it's essentially the same thing.
Okay.
Okay, so Ryan Gene Erickson, he was born in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin on January 17th, 1973 to Dennis and Mary Roth Erickson. He was one of 3 children. He had a brother, Travis, and a sister, Sonia. There wasn't a whole lot of information about his family, like his sister and his brother and that kind of stuff. So I'm just giving you what I found.
Mm-hmm.
All of the reports all came to a consensus that Ryan had a really troubled upbringing, struggling with behaviors that others would view as alarming. Many reports as to why Ryan struggled growing up was because his father, Dennis, had a lot of things going on. He was a Vietnam vet, and he was also a prison guard. And from that, he was an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure Dad struggled with a lot of like PTSD from the war, but being a prison guard can also be super traumatizing and isn't super great for your mental health.
Is it true? I heard a while back that the term PTSD wasn't even a term until like the early 80s.
Yeah, I think so. It used to be called shell shock.
Yeah, so they didn't even know really like what it was, how to diagnose it, you know. So I think mental health was just kind of a free-for-all in the late 70s up until the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. That sounds about right. I don't know, specifically when and for sure, but that would be something I could look up. So Dad was an alcoholic, and that definitely plays into developmental milestones for kids. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Later in life, while undergoing a psych eval, Ryan would admit that by the age of 6, he had sexual contact with his 4-year-old male cousin, him being the perpetrator.
Oh, uh-huh.
This would be the first incident of a long trail of speculations throughout his life. Ryan would go on to attend grade school at St. Mary's, and by 1988, Ryan was attending Campbellsport High School in Campbellsport, Wisconsin. Throughout high school, Ryan was active in wrestling, football, track, and cross country. Outwardly, he was polite, and he acted one way towards adults and people in authority, but to his peers, he was a heavy drinker who had a tendency towards violent outbursts and was considered a bully.
Okay.
According to a Hudson Police Department supplemental report, a schoolmate remembered that Ryan would, quote, spin around and claim to be Wonder Woman and would intimidate younger students.
Okay. That's that's really strange. I mean, Wonder Woman's cool, right? Don't get me wrong. Like her invisible airplane and
And her lasso.
her lasso of truth or something. I mean, she's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would spin around pretending to be a younger woman to intimidate younger foe.
Man, I don't know. Listen, his brain is a case study. It was also reported that Ryan was cruel to animals. He would regularly fill gopher holes with water and would wait for the gophers to climb out of their holes to escape, and then he would hit them with golf clubs.
That's
He,
just terrible. Because they're so cute.
I
Oh
know.
my goodness. Have you ever seen? We have a park that has all these sweet little prairie dogs in it, like a whole section of prairie dogs. They're
Yeah,
cute.
they're so
They're
cute.
so cute.
He would burn the carcasses of animals or place them on stakes. Chelsea's her face.
Gross.
At
Do you
one
know how many
point,
turtles I pick up off of the road every year?
oh yeah,
A lot.
I won't let the baby kill bugs.
I know.
I'm just
Oh, I
like I'm
know.
just like, don't do that. Don't be mean. Like, put them
Oh, I
outside.
know. I know. We used to collect ladybugs when the kids were really little. And I remember one time, like the first time that Cade was kind of exposed to it, we gathered them all up and like put them on a little stepping stone. And here comes Cade. And he's like, rah, I'd like start stomping on all of them. And I'm like, oh, why? You know, like I flipped, man.
Yeah.
I'm just like,
Zach told me
Cade, we don't
today.
do that. We don't hurt the ladybugs.
Zach told me today that so he took the baby shopping to the grocery store, and they're toting along in their shopping cart, and she holds out her hand and she's holding a bug.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a bug that she took from our driveway at our house and held in her hand for 30 minutes all the way into the grocery store. She carried this bug around with her, and she's like, bug, bug,
She
bug, bug.
loves her bug.
Yeah.
Oh man, so he's killing animals and putting them on stakes and roasting their carcasses.
And at one point, he even made like small little electric chairs for gophers to try to fry them.
Okay.
He would throw cats into the air and shoot at them with guns. So this dude, I was like, if this doesn't point to like dark triad behavior, I don't know what would. And so I wanted to include here, just kind of as like a side note, according to the New York Times article, the FBI has found that a history of cruelty to animals is one of the traits that regularly appears in its computer records of serial rapists and murderers. And the Standard Diagnostic and Treatment Manual for Psychiatric and Emotional Disorders lists cruelty to animals as a diagnostic criterion for conduct disorders. And so there's been a lot of research that correlates father unavailability to the tendency to be harmful or abusive towards animals.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize that the father unavailability had been linked to that. That's very interesting.
I think it correlates. There's not been research that it's like this is absolutely what causes it, but it definitely increases your risk towards that behavior.
Okay.
So to add to this not so great combination, there were even more dark allegations that followed him starting at an early age. A boy on his wrestling team alleged that Ryan sexually assaulted him in 1991 when the boy was 15. According to the Vilas County District Attorney's Office, the boy alleged that he and Ryan drank alcohol, watched porn, and then fell asleep. When the boy woke up, Ryan was groping his genitals. And so this is going to start a really long pattern for this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
When Ryan was 17, his father was transferred from the area where they lived for work. So Ryan ended up living with a priest, Reverend Michael, I'm going to say Morian. I don't know if it might be Moran, but where we're from, it's always pronounced Morian.
Uh-huh.
Do you think it's Moran because it's up in Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reverend Michael Moran took him in for about a year and a half so Ryan could finish high school at Campbellsport. Though this transition had the potential for a great new start and it being positive, it would turn out to be a pivotal point in Ryan's development. During his time living with Father Moran, again, according to a Hudson Police Department supplemental report, Ryan began to develop, quote, strong religious beliefs to the point of being highly opinionated.
Hmm.
If Ryan was ever challenged in these areas, he would become really angry and pretty aggressive.
Okay.
Though Ryan lived with Father Moran, he would often spend the summers with his family at Eagle River campground in Wisconsin. After Ryan graduated high school in May of 1992, that summer, he was now 18, he was on a trip to the campground with his family. Here, there were reports that despite Ryan's arguable good looks, girls would frequently flirt with him, but he would have nothing to do with them.
Hmm.
Instead, he hung around the boys. Some people believe Ryan to be gay, but was just keeping it away from his parents, primarily his dad, because Ryan was constantly talking about becoming a priest.
Hmm. Okay.
And I put ruh-roh.
Yeah.
He was slated to enter into Immaculate Heart of Mary Seminary, which was on the campus of St. Mary's University in Winona, Wisconsin. So he had kind of already been accepted to seminary school
Okay.
right after high school. So he was on the path to go to seminary and to become a priest.
Okay.
But soon after, at this time, another allegation would come from his time at Eagle River that summer.
Uh-huh.
A 14 or 15-year-old boy that had met Ryan at the campground reported that one night around midnight, the boy went to Ryan's trailer where Ryan would tell him scary stories about the devil, and then getting the boy naked, he would massage him to calm him down.
Oh.
So he would scare him by telling scary stories about the devil, get him naked, and give him a massage to help him calm down. Here, it was alleged that Ryan began to fondle the boy's genitals and then offered to give the boy oral sex, but the boy refused the offer. The boy would go on to report this incident to his mom, and she took him to the police to file a report. Now, this is kind of a sad, obviously sexual abuse is sad, but this part's kind of sad. It was reported that the boy became super depressed and began counseling to address his depression and emotional trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, investigator Albert Thompson of the Villas County, Wisconsin District Attorney's Office wasn't sure that the boy would be a reliable witness if prosecution came to light. So this boy shared that he had a lot of doubts about his own sexual orientation and was thinking of enlisting in the Marine Corps in order to kind of, quote, prove his manliness.
Oh, okay.
And so the district attorney's office was like, there were no other witnesses. And now he's kind of has this narrative that like, he's not sure if he really, not that it should matter, but this was how they were looking at it at the time.
Yeah.
And so there were no charges filed or pressed against Ryan. Did you want to say something? Or are you waiting for?
No, there's like a motorcycle or something that keeps driving around, and I'm just trying to mute it so we don't hear this like.
And this is the beginning of, I think, a theme that's going to start to make us real mad.
So essentially, I see that always worries me when, because here's my deal on things like rape or sexual assault. I get that a lot of times it's like a he said, she said situation.
Right.
And there might not be a lot of quote unquote evidence, but I still believe that it's imperative to bring it to the attention. Even if nothing ever really happens, I still think it's important to report it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if you don't, then perpetrators are like, got by with that one.
Yeah.
Nothing, like nobody said anything. Does that make sense?
And it has the potential to be healing for the victim.
That's a great point. Yes.
Right. It allows them to regain control over their voice and advocate for themselves.
Right.
I'm not saying that it can't also be re-traumatizing in its own right, but it can also be healing too.
Yeah.
And so since Ryan was going to seminary school, he'd already kind of been accepted.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of theme of this allegation was, yeah, Ryan's probably not totally innocent, but he's going to be going to seminary, so we need to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think this starts making me mad because could you imagine if this were a therapist instead of a potential priest?
No, well, and that's exactly what I was thinking, where it's like, oh, he can't be that bad. He's wanting to go to seminary school type of thing. And like you said, I mean, if it had been any other field, going into any other profession,
people would be like, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it would need to be explored, which the good news is that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And So in July of 1992, Ryan underwent a psychological evaluation because that was what the seminary had requested based off of these allegations.
Okay.
A psychological evaluation was carried out by a Dr. Anthony Malozzi, and according to
Was this the second psych eval that he's gone through at this point? Because
no,
didn't he have to go through one when he was little?
no, I said according to a later psych eval. So
Gotcha.
he would talk about his perpetrating on his cousin.
Gotcha.
Right.
At the psych eval. Gotcha.
Yeah. Well, there are multiple that are going to come up. Okay, plural. According to an article by Winona Daily News, Dr. Malozzi's evaluation concluded that Ryan was, quote, problem-free, appeared healthy, psychologically stable, and would make a outstanding priest, end quote. So with this clean bill of psych eval, Ryan entered into St. Mary's Seminary School, given the green light.
Okay.
During the first 2 years, there were some unsubstantiated concerns with Ryan and some interactions with peers, with one specific interaction that was referred to as a compromising situation with a classmate and close friend. But there's not a lot of details specifically around that. The friend woke up with Ryan sitting on his bed, but there's nothing else or more specific in the reports that I found.
Sometimes I wish that we could use just like street terminology when we write up reports. Like, you know what I mean? Sometimes I wish it could just be like, this dude was effing weird, touched me at my no-no square. You know what I mean? Because like they always use these very vague, like it was a compromising, a suspicious blurb.
Yeah. So fast forward 2 years, in 1994, the history of allegations regarding Ryan's history of sexual abuse and abusing other boys finally reached the Superior Diocese when Bishop Fliss received a report about the Eagle Lake incident. So this is starting to come to light.
Mm-hmm.
This report outlined the interaction at the campground, but the district attorney had decided, like I said, not to file charges. Bishop Fliss acknowledged receipt of this letter and then immediately took Ryan out of any responsibilities in the seminary that revolved around young people. So
they just kind of shuffled him? Like they just shuffled him?
Yeah, they were just like, we'll just take you out of any responsibilities where you're around kids.
Okay.
Bishop Fliss also made it to where Ryan had to undergo yet another psychological evaluation. This time, they wanted to specifically assess Ryan's sexual orientation and behaviors within that realm. So Ryan would undergo treatment from a Dr. George Planafsky. And Dr. Planafsky noted problems Ryan had primarily due to him being a child of an alcoholic. But other than that, according to Leon Probe's article, Dr. Planafsky had no reservations for Ryan's continuance as candidate for priestly study. So he has now had 2 psych evaluations by 2 different people, and they're like, oh, no, it's fine.
No, yeah, everything's good.
Everything's good. So the next step was St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Here, due to his previous allegations of sexual misconduct, Ryan was only provisionally admitted to St. Paul Seminary. The admission committee, acting on their concerns, consulted with Dr. Mark Hansen, who had serious reservations about Ryan getting into seminary school, as they should, right? According to a letter that would later be written by Reverend Philip Rask, Dr. Hansen, quote, found Ryan's grasp of the allegations unreflective. So in other words, he kind of wasn't really super concerned with them. Hansen thought that Ryan's 2 sexual experiences possibly could be classified as like normal sexual experimentation, especially at a young age.
Okay.
He said it did not appear to be criminal, especially since he was little. But Dr. Hansen noted, why then was there police investigations with both events?
Right. Yeah.
So that was his concern. Like if this was a normal developmental phase, then how come that there's so much police involvement in all of these instances with Ryan?
Yeah.
This also puzzled Dr. Hansen because he said, why is Dr. Planafsky, who is also Ryan's therapist, giving him a psych eval? You can't give a psych eval to your own.
I was going to say, hold on. That seems like that's not proper.
Because you're too biased.
Right.
You know too much information.
Right.
So what happened was the seminary hired an evaluator, Dr. J. McNamara. So we're on professional number what, like 4 or 5 at this
Yeah.
point?
Right.
So Dr. J. McNamara, who concluded that Ryan's behavior was within normal limits. In a memo from Reverend Ronald Bowers on the admissions committee to Reverend Philip Rask, he said that Dr. McNamara said Ryan did not appear to be, quote, predatory or exploitive in his overall orientation, and he does not seem to be a high risk for acting in a sexually aggressive or manipulative manner in the future. So essentially, he's like, I don't think he's going to reoffend.
See, and that really bothers me. I mean, for obvious reasons, but I feel the same thing about, let's say, healthcare. I really don't want a physician or a surgeon who to work on me if it's like, I mean, technically they got a 68 in the class, but they did some extra credit, got a 70. So like they're within normal range. Does that make sense? Like I feel like that this is a very high responsibility job. If you are a priest, if you are a doctor, if you are a nurse, if you are a therapist, like that's
Right.
a high responsibility job. And I'm sorry, but I don't think that we should have like, I mean, the range is pretty big, and he barely made it into this normal range.
Well, and the other thing to consider is I don't really know how the clergy system, if you will, works because I've never overlapped with that entirely. I mean, I've worked with clergy, but if I had to guess, I would guess that most of these evaluators or therapists or doctors are probably affiliated with the church or
I
have
was gonna
contracts
say
with the
they're
church.
probably handpicked.
Right. So that's my thing. And so Dr. McNamara literally said he was not a sexual predator.
All right.
And so my thought is if this dude he's now had what, 3 psych evals,
Right.
maybe that is an indication in and of itself that this is not a good fit.
Yeah, dude. I mean, maybe build another dream.
Right, exactly. So after getting another green light, there were still alarming behaviors. Oh, would you look at that? Still kept going. That Ryan exhibited despite all these professionals convinced that he could control himself. His heavy drinking continued, and he promised the seminary that he would attend AA and that he would quit drinking. Other people outside of the seminary knew Ryan as happy-go-lucky and very friendly. In fact, he was referred to as your normal, everyday, good-hearted American seminarian. So, I mean,
What?
I guess we have everyday, good-hearted American seminarian.
All right.
But I think this was just the nature of Ryan. He definitely had that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of mentality or personality, and he was really good at wearing a mask, which a lot of perpetrators are, right?
Yeah. You know what's so scary? I always think to myself, and I don't know how many times we're going to quote that meme that you love so much of the girl watching the,
Yeah.
the true crime stuff. But I'm over here and I'm like, oh, I'd have been able to see through it. I'd have been able to see through that mask. And I'm
Yeah.
sure everybody's like, oh, I wouldn't have. I would have noticed those red flags. And it's like, no, you wouldn't.
I mean, I think,
I hope I would. I hope I'd have been able to be like, nah, there's something off with you. But
yeah.
how often are we like, I mean, he just seemed like a normal dude. Like, I don't know.
So
Not bad.
I once had I got to be careful because I don't want to like call people out. I once had somebody that I worked for, and this is after I've been trained as a sex addiction therapist, pretty good, and I never got this vibe from this person, never got this vibe. And then, and this person was always very boundaried, was very,
Yeah, professional.
he was very professional, and in his role, whatever that role was, that was the expectation. So it wasn't like he was to this or to that. It fit what he was doing. And then come to find out, like a couple years later, people were like, oh, he was like breaking all sorts of boundaries, doing all sorts of things with all sorts of people. And I was like, how did I not see this? I can see this stuff a mile away. And so I think it can be very cloaking depending on your environment and depending on how somebody carries them in their role. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
And so apparently Ryan was really good at that. And so closing in on his completion of seminary, it was creeping into the time of ordination. One seminary professor voted against ordaining Ryan, sharing his thoughts that Ryan had a questionable strength of character, a tendency to deflect responsibility for his actions, no filter, and he was manipulative.
Huh. All right.
But despite this, once again, there were 14 faculty members that ended up voting in favor of Ryan's ordination.
See, and I also think that should be a unanimous thing.
Yeah.
You know, like just like on a trial, it has to be a unanimous, like that should be a hung jury, and he should have to come back before another board, in my opinion.
Or there should be like a probationary period or
Absolutely.
something. Right. I mean, I
Absolutely.
don't know how that stuff works. Obviously, I was never cut out for seminary school, so
I'm just saying, I don't feel like it matters what it is if it is a high power position, a humanitarian position, I think it should be, I think it should be a unanimous thing.
Yeah. So on June 4th, 2000, Ryan was ordained as a priest by Bishop Raphael M. Fliss of Superior, Wisconsin at St. Anne's Church in Somerset. So it's happened.
He's there.
He's there. Shortly afterwards, he was stationed at St. Patrick's Church in Hudson, Wisconsin, which is a town right outside of St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay.
So now this church has a new priest with a long history of questionable behaviors to include cruelty to animals, alcoholism, and sexual abuse. All while he had been under the seminary spotlight for 8 years and having been evaluated no less than 3 separate times. In his role as the new priest at this church, he was considered pretty hardcore. He was super traditional, conservative, and gave mass in Latin. And he had a heavy emphasis on the sins of sex and sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
But he was really charismatic and attracted a ton of new parishioners to the church.
I don't think you want my comments throughout this whole episode, so I'm going to try to keep them at bay.
Yeah. He wore a cassock and said mass in Latin, as I said, and he despised people who were not wholeheartedly dedicated to Catholicism. So he was naturally either super loved or super hated, if you will, by his parishioners and other people around him. They either really loved Father Ryan or they were like, I do not like this dude at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Some people really loved his hardcore approach, but some people thought him to be a little too much. And I was like, that is an understatement. Those who did love him trusted him wholeheartedly, allowing him to stay overnight at their houses, wrestle with their children. And one family even gave Father Ryan a 9mm semi-automatic pistol because they knew how much he loved guns.
This is wildin'. Like, what is going on? Like, Wisconsin, are you guys all right?
He would...
Or no, I'm sorry. It was Wisconsin or Minnesota that he's in?
Yeah, well, he's still in Wisconsin.
Okay.
I'm going to buy you a mansion out in Wisconsin. That T-Pain song? Okay. So he got this gun and he would proceed to wear the gun under his cassock and under his vestments at Mass. So there was a lot of stuff going on here with old Father Ryan.
This got wild.
So shifting gears just a tiny bit. Ryan did not like being around small children, but did often associate with a group of boys. So he didn't go and visit like the little kids, but he was always hanging around with the boys. Hey, did you know, fun fact, that there are lots of types of philes, and it's not just pedophile? Did you know that?
I did not know this.
Yeah. So you have pedophiles, which they show preference for prepubescent children.
Okay.
Then you have hebephiles.
Hebephiles?
He with an H, hebephile.
Hebephiles, okay.
And they have a preference for children at the cusp of puberty between roughly 11 to 14.
Oh, okay.
And then you have, what are they called? Ephebophile.
Okay.
And that's usually for the, like 15 to 16 to 17-year-olds. So they've hit puberty.
Kind of dancing on that line.
A lot of times that's my secret pet peeve is when people refer to everybody as a pedophile. And I'm like, well, technically he's a hebephile because this kid was 12 years old.
Yeah.
So fun fact. And so Ryan would take these group of boys fishing, and when they'd catch, I'm so sorry. This shit is so wild. You cannot make up. You cannot make it up. I'm crying. So he'd take them fishing, and when they'd catch fish, he'd shoot the fish with his 9mm and make them explode. Like, what?
What?
What are you doing?
I feel like there's a movie. I feel like there is a movie where they just like throw dynamite into the river or into the lake, and like all these dead fish float up.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, like, can you imagine hanging out with your priest? And he's like, come on, Jimmy, pull that fish on out here. And then he shoots him with his 9mm that's under his like fatherly robes. Like, what is going on?
But these kids probably thought it was super cool.
That's the problem.
You know, they probably were like, this dude is a modern day superhero. How cool is this?
Yeah.
Because having a boy, they do think that stuff is cool. You know,
I
like
know.
they're so into, not all of them, but a lot of them are just like, yeah, shoot him, shoot that fish. Like, because they're just,
I know.
they don't take anything into consideration. They're just like, oh, it makes noise and it explodes, and that's what's scary.
What's even more scary is Father Ryan would watch R-rated violent movies with the boys and engaged in boundaryless touching. One parishioner saw Ryan at a rural retreat center where Ryan was taking some boys swimming and rubbing their backs with mud. And this person's like, that's weird. And I'm like, yeah, yep, it is. She also saw Ryan exit the rectory with a young man who joined in a more than friendly embrace. And she was like, he just must have had a gay moment.
No.
I was like, that's not how this works.
No.
Ryan quickly became a leader at St. Patrick's in Christ Renews His Parish, a movement that brings... I'm so sorry. It's just so crazy. A movement that brings adults together for discussion about the Catholic faith, where Ryan was in charge of sex education and lectured the children about the gravity of sexual sins, abortion, and most of all, masturbation.
What?
He would send complaining emails to the parish about needing a dress code because the women are too immodest, referring to them sometimes as devils who tempted people to break into masturbating sin.
Oh, I can't, Bailey. Oh, I can't. This is so hard for me to stomach.
It was noted that he loved power, he loved being the center of attention, and was way over the top on everything. And then there began complaints to Bishop Floss. So Bishop called Ryan into a meeting, but Ryan had brought a loaded gun to the meeting. So once again, Ryan was sent out for yet another psychological evaluation to Dr. Nicholas Griffith. Now, I didn't see what the results were on that, but I assume that they're like, nah, he's good because he stays in the church.
I mean, we're in a pattern at this point. You know, it's just, and I'm sure he's getting more and more confident because he's like, okay, they'll evaluate me and I'll get by with it like I have the past 5 times or 4 times or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's creating a narrative.
Yeah. And it's, at this point, it's systematic enabling.
Oh, great word.
Right.
Great word. Or words. Great term, I guess I should say.
Yeah. So in February of 2002, St. Patrick's Church and its fellow parishioners would find themselves mourning the loss of 2 of their own.
Como se what?
So the church that Father Ryan was a priest at, in 2002, there would be a really big loss that happens. And that's what I'm about to get into.
Okay.
The first of whom was 39-year-old Dan O'Connell, and the second was 22-year-old James Ellison.
Okay.
And this is where I'm shifting the gears. Remember when I talked about earlier how it's going to feel like we're shifting around, but there's a reason I'm doing it this way.
Yeah.
So Dan was a member of one of Hudson's most prominent families and was the owner of O'Connell Funeral Home.
Okay.
Dan was married and had 2 elementary school-aged children and was the latest of several generations of O'Connells that worshipped at St. Patrick's Church. So he was a staple in the community. For generations, his family went to the church where Father Ryan was a pastor. Or a priest, I should say.
Sure.
It was reported that though Dan wasn't highly religious, he still attended church and was a positive member and volunteer within his community. Dan was a volunteer ambulance attendant and was always seen engaged in local fests and parades. Many who knew Dan O'Connell said he was gregarious, sociable, and a super solid family man.
Okay.
James Ellison was a college senior who had worked for the O'Connells, so he worked at the funeral home.
Okay.
He was a college senior who worked at the O'Connell's funeral home since the fall of 1998, when he was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. James was described as a caring and compassionate young man, and friends said that he believed in anyone and had the ability to turn himself into a perpetual giving machine and make people believe in themselves.
Oh, a perpetual giving machine.
Isn't that the sweetest?
That is the sweetest thing. Oh, that's great.
James was an incredible man with a heart, bravery, courage, and compassion. He loved everyone, and everyone loved him. And so, on February 5th, 2002, Dan O'Connell was sitting at his desk in his funeral home when an unknown man came in and shot Dan point-blank range once in the head with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Dan was killed instantly. Hearing the loud explosion, Dan's assistant, James Ellison, ran into the room, found Dan's body, and the unknown killer had returned and also shot Ellison through the skull at point-blank range. This was the second shot, as the shooter missed the first shot at James.
Oh, goodness.
Now, there were mixed reports because one said that he was shot in the back as he was leaving, and one said that he was going towards Dan and was shot in the head that way. So I'm not really sure which.
Right.
But that's, both of them was, Dan was killed first and then James. James Ellison died instantly and collapsed over a chair with a bullet casing underneath him.
Okay.
And so, out of pure happenstance, Marty Shanklin, the St. Croix County medical examiner, discovered the bodies in the early afternoon on the 5th because he came to the funeral home to pick up a death certificate.
Oh.
So these two men, Dan and James, were killed in the funeral home.
Yeah.
And then this medical examiner from the next county came over to pick up a death certificate, and that's whenever he came across the crime scene.
Oh, my goodness.
The medical examiner, obviously, he left because he didn't know if like an intruder was still in the building.
Yeah.
He called police and would later go on to tell police that the crime scene pointed to Dan O'Connell being the prime target.
Okay.
Because he said it looked like he was ambushed. He was shot while he was sitting behind his desk.
Gotcha. Right.
And so he's a medical examiner. Like, this is kind of in line with his work, right?
Yeah.
And he believes that James Ellison was just in the wrong place at the wrong time or as a witness.
Sure.
And to add to that, to corroborate this hunch, is there was nothing taken from the funeral home. Funds, everything was in order. It looked just like an in-and-out assassination.
Right.
The crime shocked the entire community because murders were so unusual in Hudson, Wisconsin.
Right.
And because one of the victims, specifically Dan, was such a prominent person in the community.
Yeah, sure.
And he had no known enemies. Same thing with James Ellison. I mean, he was in college. There was
stand-up guys, just stand-up guys.
Yep. And so everybody was just like, this shouldn't have happened, and we don't know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so when police arrived, they cordoned off the funeral home as a crime scene, and they began canvassing the area. They found one witness who said that he saw a white male wearing a light T-shirt, which was weird because it's February in Wisconsin and it's pretty cold.
Right.
He had on blue pants, a baseball cap, in front of the funeral home around 1:15 that afternoon, and left in a white sedan. Other than that, there were no clues to who the perpetrator would be in this double homicide.
Mm-hmm.
And the police were just completely baffled. They suspected drug dealers because someone had claimed at one point formaldehyde was used to like spike marijuana, which like I'm pretty sure that's not a thing. And so eventually a reward of $100,000 was offered up to anybody who knew anything about the murders of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison, but that did not produce any leads.
Mm-hmm.
Investigators would end up interviewing almost 2,000 people in this investigation process. And once again, that didn't create any leads that they could follow.
Wow. That's got to be so disheartening, right? Like, that's just got to be. I know that we're always, we're kind of hard on law enforcement in general. Not we as in you and I, but we're always like, man,
People,
why
yeah.
isn't it working faster? But that's got to be so disheartening to
Oh,
be
yeah.
going through 2,000 plus, interviews and nothing, not a
Yeah.
crumb.
Mm-hmm. And so after the shock of the murders of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison, the community in St. Patrick's, the O'Connell's church, tried to be there for the family. Ryan went to visit Jenny O'Connell, now the widow, the evening of her husband's death, and Father Ryan even celebrated the February 9th funeral mass for Dan O'Connell at St. Patrick's Church. But after the horrific double murder in their community, Ryan's behavior began to get more erratic. He would cry profusely at the altar during sermons, like he would just weep.
Weep. Yeah.
He began smoking cigars and giving harsh and passionate sermons about the sins of abortion and suicide.
Okay.
So later that year, on September 16th, 2003, Ryan was transferred to Our Lady of Sorrows in Ladysmith, Wisconsin as an assistant pastor.
Okay.
And you guys, when we have this interview with Tim Lennon on Friday, he talks about the major issue with clergy malpractice, if you will, is shuffling around.
Yes.
They just move them.
Yeah.
But once there, Ryan's behaviors were still concerning with the same types of behaviors. And the pastor there at this new church, Our Lady of Sorrows, Reverend John Anderson, finally complained to Bishop Fliss because Ryan had gone out drinking and was partying at some place with like other teenage kids.
Oh, wow. Uh-huh.
Something that was problematic despite his reports and despite that he promised to quit drinking and attend AA. And so he asked Ryan to be transferred again. So finally, on August 10th, 2004, Erickson was transferred yet another time to St. Mary of the Seven Dolores in Hurley, northern Wisconsin.
So that's this is now like his fourth church or parish.
I think
whatever.
this is technically his third.
Okay.
After seminary.
Okay.
I think. Okay, so he only lasted that one church a year before that Reverend was like, nah, he's got to go. And so they sent him to just another church.
Mm-hmm.
In January 2004, another link in Ryan's dark history came to light. And this is where I think the first domino starts to fall to put these crazy puzzle pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
An investigator by the name of Jeffrey Knops started working on a case that went back to 2003, which was a report from a North Dakota college student by the name of Thomas Smith. In 2003, Thomas Smith had come forward to Hudson police, noting that there was something he needed to report involving Father Ryan Erickson when Thomas was a teenager. So he's now in college. This is 2003, so it was a year before that he made this report. And he said that Father Ryan had provided him with alcohol as a teenager, but since it seemingly only concerned alcohol to minors, it sat unnoticed in the Hudson police files for a year. But by April 2004, when Knops interviewed Thomas Smith about his 2003 report, Thomas finally began to identify that there was a lot more than just the alcohol being given to minors involving Father Ryan Erickson.
The alcohol.
Yeah. He told Knops that when he went to college, Chelsea, this broke my heart, but it made me so, like, I got goosebumps when I read this because it made me so proud of him. He's not a kid anymore, but Thomas Smith. He said that when he went to college, he took a psychology class, and that's where he heard a description of how abusers groom their victims. And it was in that moment in his college psychology class where he realized that what had happened with Ryan Erickson was that he had been groomed, and it was more than just to be a, quote, good Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So come to find out, when Ryan was stationed at St. Patrick's Church in Hudson, this is where the murders had occurred, he visited St. Agnes High School, and that's where he met Thomas Smith, who was a teenage boy at St. Anne's at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas had gotten into some minor trouble with the law and was ordered to do some community service, and they placed him under Father Ryan Erickson's care.
Mm.
During this time, Thomas would go on to report that Father Ryan gave him beer and shots of Jaeger, They'd play drinking games and binge drink. This
Ugh.
went on for 2
I think
years.
giving somebody shots of Jaeger should be a crime in itself. Ugh.
Right? And so this went on for 2 years until the time came that more lines were crossed. Thomas would go on to report that he would undress to shower and Father Ryan would watch. Thomas added that sometimes he would pass out with no memories until the next morning. He reported that while they were drinking, Thomas would confess to masturbating, and Father Ryan would tell him that it was a mortal sin, but he was guilty of it himself. Thomas would say that Ryan even told him that, quote, he was in orgies and would always get drunk.
That Father Ryan admitted
Yes.
that he was in orgies and often get drunk?
Yes.
Oh,
On
okay.
several occasions, both Father Ryan and Thomas would be in their boxers, and Ryan would end up touching Thomas's genitals, attempting to get him to intertwine legs. Thomas said he could remember about 10 of these sexual incidents, which he thought never went as far as like anal or oral intercourse. But he was frequently drunk, so drunk that he would wake up in the morning not knowing what happened the night before.
Oh, gosh.
Thomas noted that because of this abuse, he began to heavily drink and struggled with intimacy with his girlfriend. Edward Jones, who was a friend of Thomas, noticed the change in big mood swings in Thomas, noting that he had trouble regulating and managing his mood, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's safe to
for
say.
sure. For sure.
So after the startling information from Thomas Smith, in November of 2004, Jeffrey Knops and fellow detective Sean Petty traveled from Hudson to Hurley to interview Father Ryan Erickson.
Hey,
When
I
they
have a
met,
quick question, Bailey, for
yep,
you. So as a sex therapist, as somebody who deals with sexual what?
intimacy disorders, sexual
Intimacy
acting out
intimacy
behaviors.
disorders, like you've heard the spectrum. You've been
Uh-huh.
involved with talking. So when you talked about that this young adult started having massive mood swings, major behavioral um, changes, is that something that is common with as a result of sexual abuse or sexual assault or intimacy violating boundaries being crossed, things like that?
That's a hard question to answer. Yes. And I see that a lot with like recovered or resurfaced like trauma memories or sexual abuse memories,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if they were kind of going along just fine and then all of a sudden they started having these behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
then that could be an indication. But yeah, I mean, like as far as in this case with Thomas being a teenager and then he started to get like totally out of control. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty common.
I'm just kind of wondering, like, for our listeners who are listening that have, teenage, young adult children, obviously, mood swings, you can't be like, oh my gosh, you had a mood swing, therefore you've been sexually assaulted. But if there is some sort of sneaking suspicion or something like that, is that usually a good indicator when you get these very out of, like, wow, this is really out of character for this person?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just encourage you to take them to a therapist because no matter how close you are with your children, and I don't mean to, I don't want to cast a shadow here, but if you grow up in a family that values religion
Mm-hmm.
and you go to church every Sunday and you're taught that that is a safe place, you respect clergy, you respect the religious institution. And we have to remember that perpetrators are really good at grooming and making you feel like the bad guy. The
Mm-hmm.
last thing that you're going to want to do is to admit to your parents that you sinned,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And I'm a little biased, so please, don't hear what I'm not saying, but I would even consider taking them to a therapist that doesn't necessarily specialize in like a Christian-based therapist because the
Mm-hmm.
kids are still going to have pressure to report a certain thing. Do
That
you get
makes
what I'm
sense.
saying?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So, yeah. The officers decide to give Father Ryan a visit. When they met him in his office, they noticed a globe in his office with a bottle of liquor and glasses. And these were details that Thomas had shared were a part of these drinking games when he was a teenager.
Okay.
When they met with Father Ryan, they initially told him that they simply wanted to talk to him because he had been a priest in Hudson at the time of the murders of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't telling him that they were there investigating the sexual abuse allegation. They were just like, "Oh, you're one of the priests here. You know, we just had some questions in general for you about this,
Yeah.
that, and the other."
Yeah. We're doing some routine follow-up.
Yep. And when Ryan spoke with the detectives, he suggested that the O'Connell family was likely involved in the mafia and that the two men were killed by the mafia
And
that
that's
it was
what
a hit.
Ryan told them.
Uh-huh. And while they were there, they asked Ryan how the two men were killed. And Ryan said, "I think James Ellison was going through a door and Dan was behind a desk. I think that's what I mean. If I had to say what took place, I would say James was at the door and Dan was at the desk." And the problem with this answer is that despite Ryan saying that he heard this from the news, these were details of the crimes that had never been released to the public.
I was going to say, I bet that had not been released.
So this immediately made Detective Knops and Petty highly suspicious of Father Ryan Erickson. According to Leon Podol's article, after this interview, Erickson told Faye Lindgren, the deacon's wife, that he was not going to jail. His father and brother were prison guards, and he had heard stories about being in prison. And Father Ryan insisted, "I won't let that happen." He told Deacon Russell Lundgren about how the detectives questioned him about the murder. And as they spoke, Ryan became angrier and angrier. And Ryan said, "I done it, and I'm going to get caught. Do you know what they do with young guys in prison, especially priests?" Lundgren told church staff about this remark, but did not go to police until much later.
Oh.
Yeah. The next month, in December of 2004, Ryan agreed to meet with detectives again. The detectives confronted Ryan about discrepancy in his remarks about the murders. They told him of the almost 2,000 people they interviewed, not one single person spoke to the locations of the bodies, nor how they were shot or how many times. They were like, "So how did you know all of this?" And Ryan was like, "I don't know why I know that." It was in this interrogation where the detectives now brought up the sexual assault allegation from Thomas Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Father Ryan denied having touched him sexually, and he did admit that he provided him alcohol, but that he counseled Thomas on confessions to sexual arousement. Ryan shared in this interrogation that his fear of the bishop hearing this allegation, because he was like, "All I've ever wanted to do is be a priest. That's all I've ever loved. And I would be removed from this role if Bishop Fliss found out."
Mm-hmm.
He reported he couldn't live with himself if he were to ever do any of those things. And so the police did question him about like his suicidality, his suicidal ideation, his mental health.
Yeah.
But he vehemently denied that he was suicidal. He had a good support group. He had a good job, all of this stuff. And so then they searched his car and found a loaded 9mm under his seat in his car. And shortly after this meeting, Ryan initially agreed to take a polygraph, but then said he wouldn't on advisement of counsel.
Why are these guns always under the seat of your car? Who keeps stuff under your seat? Like, the only things that I find under my seats are like half-drank water bottles, and I can't get them out. Like, I don't know how they obviously roll under there, and then I can't get them out. So why? Where do you keep these guns under your seat? Why do I always hear that it's under your seat? I need that explained.
Well, it's concealed and you can access it quickly.
No, you can't access it quickly. I can't get that water bottle out from under my seat to save my life.
Well, a gun and a water bottle aren't the same thing.
Well, I would die of thirst if it was under my seat.
So they found a gun in his car. He said he'd take under a seat. Sorry. He said he would take a lie detector, and his attorney was like, "Don't do that." And then after this conversation with investigators, he began calling his friends in Hudson, asking for an alibi for the day of February 5th, 2002, between 1 and 3 p.m. Does that sound familiar? February 5th?
Ask for an alibi?
Yeah. He was calling, asking for an alibi for February 5th, 2002. So that was when Dan O'Connell and James Ellison were killed.
Yeah.
And so Father Ryan was calling his friend saying he needed an alibi for that day and that time.
Okay, gotcha. I didn't know if you were like, does that remind you of another case? And I was like, are we talking about Danilo having a bus ticket and writing the wrong hour?
I got you. No.
Yeah,
this case.
Yeah, no. And how do you ask that? Like, hey guys, like, I just need y'all to tell them that I was with you guys. We were out playing croquet in the
It took
backyard.
like 5 years of therapy for me to learn to ask for help for like, helping picking
Right?
up some groceries at the grocery store, much less asking somebody for an alibi. I would die before I had to ask somebody for an alibi.
I don't even talk to text because I'm like, no, I can do it myself. I
I
can type
know.
my own letters in to the
I
phone.
was literally in a therapy session with a trauma therapist who was what is it called? Somatic. She was a somatic therapist. So it's all like bottom up processing. It's all about your body. And she's like, Bailey, I need you to just sit back into your chair and describe the chair. As I was describing it to her, she was like, is your back touching the back of the chair? And I was like, no. She was like, she literally told me, she was like, you have so many trust issues that you won't even trust a chair to do its job.
I know.
And I was just like, you're 1,000% correct.
I don't know, man. I don't know.
So a few days after the investigators spoke with Father Ryan, they obtained a warrant to search his computer, and that's where they found his last will and testament. Okay, just keep that on a shelf. So after the murders, Kathleen O'Connell, which was Dan's sister, heard about the Vidocq Society, and it's a voluntary association of law enforcement experts who assist in police solving crimes. The crimes are usually murders, and the society takes on a case at the request of the family. According to an article by Donna Halverson, the Vidocq Society identified Father Ryan Erickson as a strong suspect. The Hudson Star-Observer published comments from Detective Sean Petty that the case of the O'Connell Funeral Home double homicide was close to being solved.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Walter, who was a forensic psychologist and founder of the Vidocq Society, he reviewed the information that the detectives had obtained and given them new insights, and he warned the O'Connell family that the murderer would be someone that they knew.
Mm-hmm.
So there's starting to be some momentum 2 years after the double homicide of Dan O'Connell and James Ellison. They're starting to pick up some speed. They're starting to question Father Ryan Erickson.
Gotcha.
So on December 18th, 2004, two friends of Father Ryan, Richard Eanes and Tom Burns, came and hung out with him because they heard that he was upset after these multiple interrogations.
Mm-hmm.
They took him to dinner. They said he didn't seem upset or distraught. And then after dinner that night, the two men stayed in the rectory for mass the next morning. Richard got up and greeted Ryan, who seemed his usual self. Reams got ready for church, and he noticed that the door to the smoking room was closed, and he assumed that Ryan was getting ready for mass.
Mm-hmm.
When Richard got up to go start his truck, he saw Father Ryan Erickson dressed in his cassock and hanging from a fire escape at the back of St. Mary's Rectory.
Oh, no.
Richard and the church maintenance man called the police, and they even thought, because they said that Ryan was like a prankster, they thought it was a dummy at first. And then they went back, like, this was all pretty quickly.
Oh, gosh.
But they went back and realized that it was him. They discovered a ring, one of Ryan's rings that his friends had given him a couple years earlier as a gift, with a suicide note. In this note, Ryan wrote, among many things, there's a lot in it, but just kind of the tail end of it is, I've lived a hard but exciting life. I learned and I taught. I helped people and I hurt them, but I never killed anyone. My ego, my pride, my lust, my envy have always stopped me from being the best person I could be. I am tired. With my love, Father Ryan. Now, police had a suicide of a prime suspect in both a murder and a sexual assault case. They identified that his unsigned last will and testament had been initially written on November 15th, which was after his first interview by police.
Mm-hmm.
And it was later modified on December 8th, which was the day after the second interview by police.
Oh, uh-huh.
Despite leaving his computer to his family in his will, police kept it as evidence in an ongoing investigation. When they searched Ryan's hard drive on his computer, they discovered a deeply buried file under My Pictures folder, Holy Mass, Prayers, Mass Prayers, and New folder, which had been created on August 26, 2004, and last accessed December 12, 2004, shortly before his suicide.
Uh-huh.
It contained more than 40 images of gay and prepubescent male pornography in a variety of sex acts and poses. All according to Leon Podol's article, and I want to give a big shout out to this guy. He wrote like a case study of this whole thing, and that's where I got a lot of my information.
Mm-hmm.
But according to his article, police describe some of the images. Photo of 2 young males engaged in anal intercourse, mid to late teens. Young male posing naked on a bicycle, late teens, early 20s. Young male posing half naked on a weight bench. Male is holding his erect penis, late teen to early 20s. 2 young males masturbating each other, late teens to early 20s. 2 young males engaged in sexual intercourse. 1 male appears to be prepubescent and the other mid to late teens.
Mm-hmm.
1 male performing oral sex on another male, mid to late teens. And so this is all of what they found on his computer. And in the same article, it was reported that police also discovered Post-it notes signed by Ryan or Ryan XOXO, but it was not in Ryan's handwriting. The notes read, "Wear me, I'm back, come up when you return. And I'm going over to the library through the computer lab, be back as soon as possible. Try me on for size, I'm upstairs, come up when you're through. Wear these, please. I'm up in my room, anyone for that matter." So these had been Post-it note conversations with other people. We don't know who it was,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a lot of things going on with Father Ryan.
Thinking on these photographs that they found on the computer, and Bailey, like you and I have established how naive I have a tendency to be. How on earth? Like, why? Like, do these kids, do they pose for it? Do they do it by choice because they can make some money doing it?
No,
Like,
it's usually exploited or manipulated or forced or coerced. Mm-hmm.
and then the people who take them, I'm assuming probably sell them,
Yes.
or provide them. There might be a ring of people that are
Yeah.
getting this. Is that usually how that works?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. It does. And the one thing that I want to say here is I definitely do not support Father Ryan's behaviors, but for my one solid empathy stance in this case, I can't imagine how incredibly awful it would be to possibly have been homosexual, raised in a highly devoutly Catholic environment, and still pin your purpose and your identity on being the opposite representation of your struggles.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So they had found these Post-it notes. They weren't quite sure who they were, who the receiver of these Post-it notes were, but obviously there was some very suspicious activity transpiring.
And absolutely violating for his role as a priest.
Correct.
Right? And so also he wrote a letter to his family, and it's really long, and I'm not getting into the whole thing, but he went into this whole argument, like totally saying that he was innocent of the murder, saying none of the guns matched. There was no DNA of mine that was found. Nobody saw me leaving the funeral parlor. And so Dr. Walker ended up writing a letter. So Dr. Walker was that expert at that company that works with police. So he analyzed this letter, and he ended up saying like it was essentially a false letter. He said that there was aggressive anger, which Ryan justified by portraying himself as a misunderstood and wronged victim.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote with grandiosity, theatrical flair, and operatic declaration.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to present himself as a beleaguered servant of God who had become overwhelmed by the cares, vicissitudes,
Mm-hmm.
and wrongful insinuation. He presents a litany of excuses for being an aggressor. And while in this letter, so Dr. Walker says, while he's claiming he could possibly not kill anybody, he's literally planning to kill himself. And his last request in his will was, please have masses said for my soul and offer penances for my eternal rest. And Dr. Walker was like, Ryan Erickson wanted Ryan Erickson and not the victims of Ryan Erickson's crimes to be the center of everyone's care. Despite
Mm,
his pleas for prayer and forgiveness, his focus still remained on himself. He
mm-hmm.
still wanted to escape the consequences of his actions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great observation.
And so the deacon, remember when Ryan made that confession and the deacon
Mm-hmm.
didn't report it after the suicide? That's whenever he went and reported this to the police. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole lot. And now we're at the keystone to this arch that's keeping everything together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at the request of the O'Connell family, a John Doe hearing was held. According to an article by Colleen Kotke, according to the Wisconsin Court of Appeals, the purpose of a John Doe proceeding is to determine that a crime has probably been committed and who probably committed it.
Mm-hmm.
Such a hearing is held in front of a judge without a jury. It may be closed, and the standard of proof is civil rather than criminal.
Huh. I have never heard of a John Doe trial. That is fascinating.
This is also going to come up in the Pam Bulett case, too. And
Oh,
it's both
okay.
Wisconsin. So it was weird that I did two back to back, and they were both Wisconsin, and they were both John Doe hearings. It was super
Huh.
weird.
That is weird.
So witnesses can be compelled to testify under the threat of jail time. Only 5 states have this investigative tool, and it is rarely used. St. Croix District Attorney Eric Johnson presented the evidence to Judge Eric Lundell on October 3rd, 2005. 15 witnesses testified, revealing much of the information contained in the case study. And so we're going to go to the main components of this John Doe hearing and what they found.
Okay.
Number 1, biggest piece. This is arguably the biggest piece of this puzzle that ties all these things together. The night before the murders, Ryan and Dan O'Connell had an argument in which Dan O'Connell threatened to reveal him as a child sex abuser.
Oh, snap.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be problematic
Uh-huh.
for Father Ryan.
Yep. On the day of the murders, the secretary at St. Patrick's got a call at 2 p.m. to send a priest to the funeral home. She couldn't locate Father Ryan. About 2:30, Ryan paid an unexpected visit to the Carmelite monastery a few blocks from the funeral home in Hudson. He had said mass for them, but had never previously visited them. And while he was there, he told the nuns that Dan and his assistant had been murdered.
Hmm.
On the day of the murder, a friend of the O'Connells called St. Patrick's to ask that a priest visit Dan's widow, Jenny O'Connell. Ryan showed up that night, not even like right after it happened, that night with a short prayer, left immediately, and per a report from a family friend, he showed no emotion, was not the least bit sympathetic. So after this John Doe hearing, Judge Lundell stated at the end of the hearing about the murders and sexual assaults, quote, "I find that and conclude that Ryan Erickson probably committed these crimes in question. On a scale of 1 to 10, as far as strength of evidence, I would consider this 10. It is a
Wow.
very strong case for circumstantial evidence."
Mm-hmm.
However, the investigation into Father Ryan Erickson had significant blocks, and especially by Father Ryan's diehard supporters who turned him into some kind of like troubled martyr.
Right. Yeah.
Many of his supporters were and are conservative Catholic families that were reluctant to believe that Father Ryan had abused kids.
Right.
They impeded the investigation by not speaking with authorities or investigators due to their belief that Father Ryan Erickson could possibly have done anything, especially with the murders for Dan O'Connell and James Ellison.
Man. And I feel so bad for church families when things like this happen because it is just soul shaking.
It's such a betrayal.
It is such a betrayal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great word for it. It is just the ultimate betrayal.
After the hearing, James Ellison's mother said that the clergy are not above suspicion.
Mm.
And no one from the diocese called the O'Connells' widow to offer condolences or apologies, except
Mm.
for Ryan, who arguably was the alleged murderer.
Right.
When the O'Connell and Ellison families tried to meet with the Catholic bishops in November of 2005, when the bishops were meeting in Washington, the families were first, quote, ejected from the downtown hotel and then invited back for a 10-minute discussion with a member of the bishop's staff. They were told the bishops could not speak to the families because they were much too busy and they had a full agenda.
Hmm.
Although the Diocese of Superior knew that Ryan had admitted to 2 incidents of sexual abuse before he entered the seminary, that he was accused while in the seminary of another incident of sexual abuse, and that he behaved questionably at the seminary, it did not list him as an accused priest in its own audit of sexual abuse or in the survey that the bishops of the United States had commissioned the John Jay School of Criminal Justice to do in 2004, because the incidents and accusations did not technically occur when Ryan was a priest. When Bishop Fliss was asked why he took so long to visit the parishes in which Ryan had been stationed, he replied, "I don't really have a good answer for that."
Okay.
When asked whether he thought Ryan committed the murders, he replied, "I still hope he didn't. In my heart, I still hope he didn't." The O'Connells filed a suit against the U.S. Catholic bishops, asking them to reveal the names of all credibly accused priests, and that lawsuit was later dismissed in 2007.
Oh, man.
And so that is the black collar case of Reverend Ryan Erickson and the countless victims, including Thomas Smith, Dan O'Connell, and James Ellison.
So at the end of the John Doe trial, really the only thing that the judge could say was he probably did it. But there's no, I mean, it's not really an official,
No,
he was found guilty,
no,
blah, blah, blah.
because he committed suicide.
Well, and did they talk any about like the 9mm gun that he had, and did it match ballistics? Was there any, did they
I
look
don't know.
into that?
I don't know. I'm sure they did, but there was a lot more about this case with, at least that I found, with the sexual assault stuff or the sexual abuse stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I just don't know. I really don't. So it's still kind of, and if you ask people today, half the people are just like, absolutely, he 1000% was the killer and he did all of
Right.
that. And the other 50% are just like, he was the most straight-laced, narrow, what's the word I'm looking for? Like,
By the book.
by the book priest. He was amazing. He's one of the best priests we've ever known. And people will absolutely not see it. And this goes into what we talked about in Tim Lennon's interview about like how it's not uncommon for parishioners of a church to also knowingly and or unknowingly protect the perpetrators as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, but again, I feel like if your description and what you've talked about with you know, Ryan specifically, if he only showed that one side of himself
Yeah.
to people, then what would give a person any reason to think that he would do this? You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's so hard as a person in general to judge character if we're only given this facade,
Yeah.
right? Like that's what we have to go off of.
Yeah. I mean,
And
that's fair. And you expect that becoming a priest is a rigid process where you're under scrutiny and there's a lot of, kind of hoops you have to jump through.
for sure.
And
For
so
sure.
including psychological, and I mean, kudos to the church for making him take psychological evaluations. But I think it's kind of like, you don't pass out candy if you also don't want to treat the cavities. You know what I mean?
Well, that's kind of what I also feel that way where, yes, good job on having psych evals, but if it is just a box for you to check and you're not going to take appropriate actions once those psych evals are administered, then
Yeah.
why are we doing psych evals? That's not a pat on the back if we're
Right.
not going to take the results of them, or if the results are going to be constantly skewed because of bias. So that's another thing that's troublesome for me is it just seems like more manipulation in that setting. I'm not saying across the board, but in that setting that they're doing these psych evals, but then they're not doing anything, or the reports are contradictory to the
Yeah.
behavior, which warranted the
Yeah.
psych eval.
Yeah. And so something I really have to say while I have a platform, and this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers, especially you mamas out there who raise your children in churches. And listen, I'm not opposed to raising your children in churches. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing in a lot of ways. As a sex addiction therapist, I cannot recall anecdotally ever working with any sex addict client who did not start off by being shamed in their prepubescent or teenage years for any sexual behaviors or
Mhm,
sexual functioning. Okay.
mhm, mhm,
Most of the stories that I get come from males who grew up in highly devoutly religious households,
mhm.
and specifically were shamed by their parents, specifically their mother, about things surrounding masturbation, just natural developmental processes of the human body. So,
Right, right.
unless you guys want your kids to be terrified to talk to you about things that come up, this is where neurons that fire together wire together. This is why it happens, right?
Yeah,
If you put sex in the box with shame, then people are always going to have sex and shame in the same box. And this is a perfect example of how that happens.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that although a culture may have evolved, the biology of a human being has not. And I say
Thank
that
you.
to mean, huh?
I said thank you.
So I say that to mean, if you think about it, historically, young men were probably getting married by the time that they were having these urges, these feelings,
Yeah.
right? Traditionally, people were getting married at a much younger
Especially
age.
hundreds of years ago. Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like they were getting married way earlier
And women
than
were bearing
our
children at 13, 14 years old. Yep.
yes, they were bearing children at 13, 14 years old. Again, biologically, that is how our bodies prove to be. It is our culture that has evolved, right? So now it's like you're getting these urges, but you're far too young, quote unquote, you're far too young to having these urges. Well, you're young relative to our culture because now people don't get married. They don't want to start a family until they might be in their 20s or 30s.
Right.
And I feel like that's important to remember when we're talking about sexual urges and things like that when you're raising, I would say primarily male children. Not that females don't have sexual urges, but again, like you said, it is a very
I have
natural thing.
I feel so passionately about this because I've had to do so much trauma work to unwire this stuff
Hmm.
in people. I have
Yeah,
worked with grown adults who have been married, have children, and feel guilty for having lust towards their husband because
yeah,
it's bad and it's gross and it's shameful. And
yeah.
so, and I'm just again, I don't want to tell people how they want to parent, but I want you guys to understand that instilling fear in your teenagers about sex is not going to stop them from doing it, because biologically they are programmed to experience and explore that.
Right.
But it will absolutely keep them more secretive. And that is the recipe of becoming a sex addict later on
Yeah.
in life. Right.
Yeah.
So telling your 12-year-old son, don't masturbate because God is watching, that is not going to make him be like, oh, wow, well, let's not think about that, or let's not do that. But if you sit down with them and you say, hey, like, I understand this can be a confusing time, and I understand this, and have an open conversation with them, at
Mhm.
least so they don't walk away feeling shameful about the biological processes that's happening.
Absolutely. And I won't mention where I attend church, but I have to admit, I feel like the youth group and the youth program that that we are involved with are very open on that subject of, you know, naturalizing it. There's a reason why to wait to, have sex and all of that stuff, right? I mean, there's some moral things and some emotional things, but more than that, we focus a lot. I've seen it within our specific church. They focus a lot on it is a beautiful thing. It was designed to be a beautiful thing. And there's not a lot of fear and shame. And they do parental classes
That's great.
that I've attended that it's not based on shame. It's not based on fear. It's more on statistics. This is usually
It's
when the urges start.
education.
It's
That's
education.
that's
And
what kids need. They need to know what they're up against, but they don't need to be made to feel like they're gross or defective, or that they're a pervert just by experiencing very natural things.
right,
And just because you might not be comfortable with your own sexuality or your own body or your own history of sex, or that whole box, don't project that onto your children
yeah,
unnecessarily. If you need
yeah,
some help, talk to a trusted individual to help you walk through it, or buy a book. There's lots of
yeah.
books to help you, but
Yeah, for sure. So I'm glad to see that I am seeing that in a Christian setting. It's it's much more open, or at least in my experience it is. So it is out there. There
it's
are
getting
there
better in some ways.
yeah, they're open, there are but always be careful. Always be vigilant, always
No.
ask questions, always, have a little bit of skepticism on anybody who's around your child.
Yeah.
And that's healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. But, well, Bailey, you did a great job getting me through this one. I really appreciate the honesty of this case, the horror of what can happen in a black collar crime. But
No.
I thought you did that very, very tastefully and very well. I know that
Thank
was really
you.
hard.
Yeah, it's a heavy one, so we're gonna get off of our soapbox here, you guys. We're gonna exit at this station, and then we're gonna hop back on this gravy train on Friday with our wonderful guest, Tim Lennon, who is a clergy abuse survivor and an advocate. So
And an advocate. Yeah.
it might have you being pretty emotional, but it's definitely stuff that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys.
Thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy black collar crime of a ride.
And we'll catch you on the flip side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators. Hey, Wildside Tribe. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below.
As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on
The flip side.